They do not hate you because you hurt them. They resent you because you reveal something they can no longer control. For the narcissistic personality, control is not merely a preference. It is a psychological necessity. It is the unseen framework that keeps their inner world intact. Without it, there is a risk of collapse, of facing something far more threatening than conflict with others. The instability that exists within themselves. As a result, they learn, often without conscious awareness, to manage everything around them. They manage how people see them, how conversations progress, and how relationships are defined. Every interaction becomes a subtle negotiation of power. It is not always loud or obvious, but it is calculated, intentional, and deeply rooted in fear. At the center of this need is a fragile identity, not fragile in appearance, but fragile in its foundation. The image they present, confidence, superiority, certainty, is carefully constructed to compensate for something unresolved beneath the surface. Because this identity is built rather than genuinely discovered, it requires constant protection. It cannot simply exist. It must be maintained. This is where you enter the picture. The moment you begin seeing through the patterns, questioning the inconsistencies, or refusing to participate in their narrative, something changes. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer manageable. And in that moment, you become a threat. Not because of anything you have done, but because of what you represent. You represent uncertainty. You represent truth. You represent the possibility of losing control. And for someone whose psychological stability depends heavily on maintaining control, that loss feels unbearable. It does not register as a simple disagreement or a difference in perspective. Instead, it registers as danger. But rather than turning inward to examine why the reaction feels so intense, the mind redirects. It looks for a way to restore balance without dismantling the illusion that has been carefully maintained. The easiest way to accomplish this is through blame. Blame is powerful. It shifts responsibility outward. It protects the image of perfection. It transforms discomfort into accusation. Suddenly, the story changes. You are no longer the observer. You become the cause. In many situations, this is not a conscious strategy. It functions as an automatic defense mechanism, a way to avoid confronting the deeper reality that something inside them is unstable, incomplete, or unresolved. Because facing that reality would require dismantling the very identity they have spent years constructing. Over time, this pattern becomes increasingly rigid. The more their control is challenged, the more intense the projection becomes. Minor conflicts begin escalating. Neutral actions are interpreted as attacks. Your independence is viewed as defiance. Your clarity is interpreted as cruelty. At the same time, their internal world becomes increasingly chaotic. The effort required to maintain the illusion continues to grow. Relationships begin straining under the weight of unrealistic expectations. Trust slowly erodes, not because others are inherently untrustworthy, but because control has replaced genuine connection. This is where consequences quietly begin unfolding, not as some external force delivering punishment, but as a natural outcome of imbalance. The tighter they attempt to hold everything together, the greater the pressure building beneath the surface. And pressure that remains ignored does not disappear. It searches for a release. Gradually, cracks begin appearing. Inconsistencies become more difficult to conceal. The admiration they depend on becomes less reliable. People start creating distance, not always dramatically, often very gradually. And with every loss, the need for control grows stronger, creating a cycle that continually feeds itself. From their perspective, this rarely feels like self-created suffering. Instead, it feels like betrayal, misunderstanding, injustice. And so the blame continues, because blame becomes the only remaining tool capable of preserving the illusion of order. Yet beneath all of it, the truth remains unchanged. Control was never the answer. It was merely the mask. And when that mask begins to slip, everything it was designed to conceal starts revealing itself. The parts of themselves they buried never truly disappeared. They simply waited. And now they begin returning. There is a part of the human psyche that does not respond to denial. It does not dissolve through avoidance, nor does it weaken simply because time passes. Instead, it retreats into the background and waits. In psychological terms, this is often described as the shadow, the collection of traits, emotions, impulses, and experiences that a person refuses to acknowledge as their own. For the narcissistic structure, the shadow is not merely uncomfortable. It feels intolerable. The self they present to the world depends upon contrast. They are strong because weakness has been exiled. They are right because doubt has been rejected. They are worthy because shame has been pushed away. Every disowned part eventually becomes something projected outward, something recognized in others, but never accepted internally. At first, this system appears stable. The unwanted aspects are successfully pushed aside, and life continues under the illusion of coherence. But the psyche never forgets what it has removed. What is disowned does not vanish. It accumulates energy within the unconscious, creating pressure that continues growing over time. This is where projection becomes stronger. Instead of recognizing anger within themselves, they perceive hostility in others. Instead of acknowledging insecurity, they sense judgment everywhere they look. Instead of confronting emptiness, they accuse others of being cold, detached, or emotionally vacant. The shadow is no longer fully contained. It begins moving outward, coloring perception itself. This is where you become highly significant within the psychological drama, not because you contain anything foreign, but because you unknowingly reflect what has been denied. You become the surface upon which disowned traits are projected, the qualities they cannot tolerate within themselves suddenly seem to exist in you, distorted and magnified. What makes this process so unstable is its unconscious nature. It does not feel like projection from the inside. It feels like recognition. It feels like certainty. The emotional intensity attached to it makes the perception seem unquestionably true. Yet beneath that certainty lies fragmentation. As time passes, the boundary between inner reality and external reality begins to blur. The psyche struggles to maintain separation between what belongs to the self and what has been projected outward. This creates psychological tension that must constantly be managed. The mind attempts to stabilize itself through narratives, justifications, accusations, and explanations. Yet the shadow continues pushing upward. It appears in moments of emotional reactivity that seem disproportionate to the situation. It emerges in relationships that repeatedly follow the same patterns of conflict. It shows itself in dreams, irritations, compulsive judgments, and recurring emotional triggers. The more it is resisted, the more strongly it seeks expression. From the outside, this may appear as instability within relationships or sudden emotional volatility. Internally, however, it is experienced as threat. The ego feels surrounded by forces that seem external, but are actually returning aspects of the self. Every trigger becomes amplified because it is not only about the present moment. It is connected to everything that has been pushed away and is now demanding attention. In this state, blame becomes essential for psychological survival. If the shadow is recognized as internal, the entire identity structure begins to feel vulnerable. So the mind externalizes it again. Responsibility is assigned elsewhere. A cause outside the self is created to preserve internal coherence. In these moments, you are no longer viewed as a separate individual. You become a container for what cannot be integrated. This is why interactions often become emotionally charged, distorted, and disproportionate. The conflict is not truly between two people. It is between a person and their own disowned psychological material. Meanwhile, life begins reflecting this inner fragmentation outwardly. Relationships lose stability because genuine connection requires integration rather than projection. Trust deteriorates because perception becomes filtered through internal conflict instead of present reality. Situations repeat themselves with different faces, but the same emotional pattern remains underneath. What appears to be external chaos is often the psyche attempting to reintroduce what was excluded. The shadow does not return as an enemy. It returns as an unwelcome reminder of wholeness. It seeks recognition through disruption, repetition, emotional pressure, and recurring patterns. They did not lose everything because of you. They lost everything because what they built was never truly real. The false self is not a personality in the ordinary sense. It is a construction, a psychological structure designed to manage perception, stabilize a fragile identity, and maintain the illusion of superiority, certainty, or emotional invulnerability. It is assembled over many years through adaptation, learning which traits receive approval, learning which emotions must remain hidden, learning which version of the self prevents rejection and secures validation. At its core, the false self serves a protective function. It exists to shield the individual from inner instability. It protects them from shame that was never fully processed. It protects them from vulnerability that once felt unsafe to express. But protection built upon illusion comes with a cost. It requires constant maintenance. Every interaction becomes another opportunity to reinforce the image. Every relationship becomes another source of validation. Every challenge becomes another threat that must be neutralized. The false self cannot rest because it is not grounded in authenticity. It survives through reinforcement. And the greater the distance between the false self and the authentic self, the more energy is required to sustain the illusion. Eventually, the burden becomes difficult to carry. The contradictions become harder to ignore. The emotional strain grows heavier, and the cracks that once appeared small begin spreading through the entire structure. What once seemed powerful starts revealing its instability. What once seemed certain begins showing signs of doubt. And what once appeared untouchable gradually becomes exposed. This is not because someone else caused the collapse. It is because anything built upon avoidance eventually encounters reality. The authentic self may be vulnerable, imperfect, and uncertain, but it is real. The false self may appear strong, flawless, and superior, but it depends on constant protection, and sooner or later, reality places pressure on every illusion. When that pressure arrives, the structure either adapts through self-awareness and integration, or it continues defending itself against truths that refuse to disappear. The tragedy is that the very things being avoided, vulnerability, accountability, uncertainty, and emotional honesty, are often the same things that could bring genuine healing. Yet accepting them would require letting go of the image. And for someone deeply invested in the false self, that can feel like losing everything. What they fail to realize is that the illusion was never their strength. It was their prison. And the more fiercely they defend it, the more disconnected they become from themselves, from others, and from the reality that has been waiting patiently beneath the surface all along. It depends heavily on external validation, on constant reinforcement from other people, and on environments that do not challenge its contradictions. For a period of time, it can function remarkably well. It can charm, persuade, impress, and dominate social situations. It can create an image that appears solid, confident, and convincing. But what is projected outward is not necessarily the same as what exists inwardly. The structure remains coherent only as long as it is not pushed beyond its limits. The collapse usually begins quietly. It rarely arrives as one dramatic event. Instead, it starts with subtle disruptions, small inconsistencies that can no longer be controlled, relationships that stop responding as expected, admiration that begins to fade, weaken, or shift elsewhere. These disturbances introduce uncertainty into a system that depends upon certainty. As control starts weakening, the false self is forced to work harder. More narratives are created, more justifications are constructed, more emotional energy is invested in maintaining appearances. Yet this effort does not strengthen the structure, it exposes its fragility. Anything that requires constant maintenance in order to appear stable is already unstable beneath the surface. Gradually, the external world begins reflecting this internal strain. Conflicts become more frequent, misunderstandings grow more intense. People who once played their roles in sustaining the illusion begin to withdraw, question, or resist. What was once mirrored back as admiration, validation, or agreement slowly becomes distance, skepticism, indifference, or silence. This shift is profoundly destabilizing. The false self does not know how to exist without external reinforcement. It was never designed to function independently of validation. So when that validation weakens, the system does not adapt smoothly. It begins to fracture. Emotional reactions become more extreme. Perception becomes increasingly distorted. The need to assign blame grows stronger. You, within this dynamic, become part of the narrative not because of what you have done, but because of what you represent. You represent disruption. You represent a challenge to the illusion. The false self struggles to distinguish between challenge and threat. Any force that destabilizes its structure is experienced as opposition, even when it is simply reality asserting itself. Meanwhile, something far more significant is occurring internally. The gap between the constructed identity and the underlying reality becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Moments of doubt begin surfacing. Emptiness becomes more noticeable during quiet moments. The energy required to maintain the persona begins consuming resources that were once taken for granted. This is where fragmentation starts revealing itself. The self-image no longer feels seamless. Contradictions become increasingly difficult to reconcile. Emotional responses become inconsistent with the image being projected. The mind attempts to restore unity by doubling down on the construction, but every effort at reinforcement reveals another crack. What follows is not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. The structure weakens under the weight of its own contradictions. Relationships that once supported the image can no longer sustain it indefinitely. Social environments that once affirmed it begin challenging it. Internal stability becomes harder and harder to maintain without constant external input. In psychological terms, this is not punishment, it is consequence. A system built upon appearance rather than integration cannot remain intact when reality begins demanding authenticity. The collapse is not caused by a single event, circumstance, or person. It emerges from the accumulation of unresolved tension between who is being presented and what actually exists beneath the presentation. Blaming you is not the truth. It is often the final defense against psychological disintegration. Projection is one of the psyche's most primitive and powerful defense mechanisms. In its original form, it is not created for manipulation. It is created for survival. When inner experiences become too threatening to acknowledge, too painful to accept, or too incompatible with the image of the self, the mind redirects them outward. What cannot be contained internally is assigned externally. For a personality organized around control, superiority, or emotional invulnerability, this mechanism becomes especially important. The internal world is carefully curated. Certain emotions are labeled unacceptable: shame, insecurity, dependence, envy, neediness, vulnerability. These experiences do not disappear when rejected. They accumulate, and pressure within the psyche always seeks release. Projection becomes that release valve. Instead of "I feel inadequate," the experience becomes "you are judging me." Instead of "I feel out of control," it becomes "you are trying to control me." Instead of "I feel unseen," it becomes "you are deliberately ignoring me." The internal state remains intact, but it is relocated onto another person where it feels easier to manage. What makes projection so persuasive is that it does not feel like distortion from the inside. It feels like clarity. The emotional charge attached to it creates certainty. The mind does not experience it as "I am transferring my internal state outward." It experiences it as "I am recognizing what is actually happening." This certainty is what stabilizes the ego during moments of internal threat. Within this dynamic, relationships become psychological screens. They are no longer experienced as separate individuals interacting with one another. Instead, they become containers for disowned emotional material. The other person becomes a symbolic figure rather than a complete human being. They carry emotional weight that cannot be tolerated internally. This is where misunderstanding deepens. What is being reacted to is not always what is actually present in the relationship. It is often an internal echo triggered by proximity, tone, independence, success, boundaries, or emotional distance.